Welcome to this workshop on the Guidelines and Principles for Nonprofit Excellence. Today we will be talking about how to use the Guidelines and Principles for Nonprofit Excellence, including how to access it, why it can be of use to your organization, and a few items related to legal compliance. This tool is provided by the Nonprofit Association of the Midlands. We are a nonprofit that exists to support nonprofits, and we do that through providing tools such as the guidelines principles and also training, networking, and advocacy opportunities. We are a member of the National Council of Nonprofits, which provides us with a national network of resources to help you run your nonprofit business. A little bit of background information about how we got here. You may remember the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. It is some legislation that was enacted as a result of some accounting mismanagement that happened on the part of corporate boards. Because nonprofits are also beholden to the public trust, there are elements of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act that also apply to the nonprofit sector, specifically in our document retention and destruction policies, our whistleblower protections, and our conflict of interest policies. And we will dive a little bit deeper into those later in this presentation. But for now, note that the Sarbanes-Oxley Act increased government scrutiny on the activities of nonprofits and our boards of directors, and increased our obligations for self-regulation and our need for transparency and accountability to the public. It's important to give credit to our partners that helped us create this tool. As we are creating and maintaining the guidelines and principles for nonprofit excellence, we work closely with our partners at the National Council of Nonprofits and our colleagues in Minnesota, Michigan, Montana, and Colorado, who also offer similar tools along with 17 other states across the country. The Guidelines and Principles was created to provide a toolkit and a roadmap for nonprofits to use as they get their arms around the infrastructure of their nonprofit business. We use it to provide individual organizations with state-specific as well as federal information regarding regulatory compliance and nonprofit best practices. We use it to support and build the capacity of the nonprofit sector, and to increase public understanding of the role and the contributions of the nonprofit sector in Nebraska and Southwest Iowa. We are an important part of the economy, an important part of the vitality of our communities, and the Guidelines and Principles helps us to illustrate the business side of nonprofit operations. The intent of the Guidelines and Principles is to provide a set of recommendations, some suggested ethical or managerial directions for your nonprofit, and proposed methods in achieving the transparency and accountability that is expected of us as nonprofits. It's important to note that the Guidelines and Principles is not required for you to complete. There are some funding sources that require the completion of the Guidelines and Principles. However, in terms of being a member of NAM or being a nonprofit, it is not required for you to use. However, we hope that you will use it as a tool for you to refine your nonprofit operations. The Guidelines and Principles provide state-specific information as well as federal information for nonprofit operations. The Guidelines and Principles contains state-specific information for those nonprofits with operations in Nebraska, Kansas, and Iowa. We hope you will use the Guidelines and Principles as a toolkit as you get your arms around the infrastructure of your nonprofit business. It's important to note that we don't use language such as certification. We don't say that an organization is Guidelines and Principles certified. This is a completely self-monitored, self-paced tool for you to use in a way that works for you. So we don't check your work in any way, although we will provide assistance as you need it. So because we don't do any sort of checking of your policies and procedures or monitoring of your work using the Guidelines Principles, we don't use language like certification. We simply say an organization is using the Guidelines and Principles or is not using the Guidelines and Principles. We also don't use it to monitor your organization or monitor your compliance in any given area. Again, we don't check your work, but we will provide assistance in any way that you need. We don't ever use the guidelines and principles to compare one organization to another organization. We don't assign a grade or anything like that. We simply offer it as a roadmap as you refine the infrastructure of your nonprofit. And then finally, it's important to note that it is not substitute for legal counsel. We are happy to talk with you about how other organizations have made sense of any given item within their nonprofit. Or we are happy to look over a document or a policy that you have created as you use the guidelines and principles and tell you if it looks like what has worked for other organizations or if it fits best practice as we understand them. But note that there may be things that are unique about your organization that might require you to seek out your own legal counsel as you are creating new policies. Again, we hope you will use the guidelines principles as a tool to identify and define any legal compliance obligations and best practices within your organization. We hope you will use it to focus your operational and your strategic planning to identify both areas where you may be out of compliance as well as areas where you are doing really well. We hope you will use it to create action plans to address organizational challenges within your teams, within your board, and within your organization, as well as identify areas of strength and growth opportunities. There are 12 areas of nonprofit operations addressed within the guidelines and principles. Some of them are heavier than others. For example, the communication section is a fairly short section that helps you think through your internal and external communication practices, your marketing plans, your social media policies, and things like that. So that's a fairly short section that many people can work through fairly quickly. However, the financial management section, fundraising, governance, human resources, there are a lot of legal compliance items within that apply to us either as employers or as nonprofit organizations. So those sections might take a little bit more time. It's important to note that there is no time limit when you are completing the guidelines and principles. You can choose to take a year and complete one section a month. You can choose to take 2 years to complete the guidelines and principles. Whatever works for you is the right way to use the tool of the guidelines and principles. Again, we want it to be a tool. We don't want it to be something that you have to slog through once a year or anything like that. We hope that it will be something that is useful for you as you are building up the infrastructure and your capacity in your nonprofit. There are 3 levels of assessment within the guidelines and principles. Legal practices are just what it sounds like, things that we are legally obligated to do as nonprofits or as employers. Even though something is marked as a legally required item, however, it's important to read each item carefully. Things may or may not apply to you. There are differences in applicability in the legal practices that may depend on your staff size or your budget size. So it's important to read each item carefully because just because it might be a legal item, it may or may not actually apply to you. The next level of assessment is essential practices, which are things that we understand to be best practices within the nonprofit sector. It's important to note here, though, that again, it's still important to read each item carefully. There may be things within your organization, cultural issues within your organization, issues within the community or the people you serve that may make something not a best practice from your perspective. So again, read each item carefully and use it as a tool. Then finally, recommended practices. These are things that we hope you will consider, things that we would like you to be aware of, but they are less immediately impactful for many nonprofits when compared to the items that fall in the legal practices section as well as the essential practices. How we hope you will use the guidelines and principles is we hope that you will complete the assessment start to finish one time. We feel that this is the best way to get a baseline read as to where you are at in terms of your nonprofit infrastructure. We recommend that you don't overthink it. You just open up the assessment, start it, and set aside about an hour to complete it. Don't put too much work into it. Just complete the assessment one time to get that baseline report that will then give you a place to start as you move forward. You will then, the system will automatically generate a report for you. which will just be a static report of the data that you have entered in at that point in time. You can then use that to first identify any items where you may be out of compliance in relation to legal compliance. That's where you want to start. Those are the items that can be most immediately impactful to the health of your nonprofit. We hope you will pull in your staff leadership as well as your board of directors as you are refining your infrastructure and using the guidelines and principles. We hope you will use it to create prioritized action plans so you can maybe address some low-hanging fruit first. And then achieve a new level of capacity. You will have policies and practices that weren't in place before that will enhance your capacity as well as your operations. Then we hope you will repeat that process once a year, at least once a year. Now, newer organizations or organizations that maybe have experienced a lot of growth and you now need policies and procedures in place that you didn't before, you may want to revisit your guidelines principles more often than once a year. But once you have reached a fairly stable level of operations, most organizations simply need to review their guidelines principles once per year in order to maintain compliance. It's important to note here that we do shut down the assessment every December to make any updates. And those updates will include changes in legal compliance or best practices. And they may include some clarification of items that our users have said are confusing or repetitive within the assessment. So because we do make those updates once a year, we hope a nonprofit organization will revisit their assessment at least once a year to make sure that it is still up to date and you are still within compliance. How to get started. There are two ways to get started. The most common way is when you are a new organization, if you have never used the guidelines and principles before, is to just go to guidelandandprinciples.org, click Start the Assessment, and dive into the assessment. Now, if your organization has used the guidelines and principles before, it's important to reach out to a NAM staff member because we can pull a link for you that will allow you to access data that has been previously entered within the assessment. Now, you can start new even if somebody else has done the guidelines principles within your organization before. There's certainly no harm in just starting a fresh assessment, particularly if you're a new leader and you'd like to address the assessment with fresh eyes. However, if you don't want to have to start from scratch and somebody within your organization has completed the guidelines principles before, we are probably able to access that data and we'll be able to provide you with a unique link that will allow you to update your assessment at any time. The first screen you will see will be an opportunity for you to create your account. What is important to note on this screen here is, first of all, your organization name. Obviously, that is the name of your organization, and then your EIN number. So your EIN number is something that is used as a unique identifier within the tool. Many nonprofit organizations have similar names, and so your EIN number helps us to differentiate between organizations with similar names. You can get past this screen by just entering 9s or 0s in that field. We hope, though, that you will take the time to enter your EIN number in that field because that does help us down the road when we are trying to differentiate different organizations. It's also important to note that leaving this field with 9s or 0s also signals that the tool that this is an incomplete assessment, and so your assessment is at risk of being purged if it remains incomplete for 2 years. So it's worth the time to just look up your EIN number and enter it in that field. Then you will enter the name and the email of the person who will be the owner, so to speak, of your Guidelines Principles account. Anybody with the link that the portal will provide to you that allows you to update your assessment can use the assessment. However, this email address is where the automated emails that are created by the survey portal will be sent. So that just needs to be, that can be a common email address that many people can access, or it can just be somebody that will be using the assessment the most. But anybody with the link can use the assessment. Then you'll just dive in. This is the first section that you will encounter when doing the guidelines and principles will be legal practices. These are all of the items from each of the 12 areas of operations addressed within the guidelines and principles that are related to legal compliance. You will see the essential practices and the best practices later within the assessment, but the first page that you will see will be these items related to legal compliance. If you do nothing else within the guidelines and principles, we hope you will complete this first page, the legal practices, because these are the items that are going to be most immediately impactful to the health of your nonprofit and can impact your 501c3 status. I wanted to point out that this is a page of the assessment. This is how it looks once you get started. And these are just radio buttons. A couple things to note here. First of all, I want to note that every time you add different information or new information to the guidelines principles assessment, it overwrites any previously entered data, and there is no way for us to pull old data. So if you want a snapshot of your guidelines principles assessment as it stands before you start entering new data, it's important to just hit submit, and then the portal will automatically send you a report of your responses as they now stand, and it will be in a PDF. And then that's something that you can save in a file or use for a reference or something like that. But the minute you start entering new data, it will overwrite anything that was there before. So that's just an important note, and there's no way to retrieve that. Another thing I want to note on this slide is your answer options. Now, I know this seems very straightforward, but it does trip people up. So it's worth the time to talk it through really quick. Answering yes on any item means that you are fully compliant with that item. That means that that's something you should be doing and that you are in fact doing it. In progress means you're working on it, but not quite yes yet. No means that this is something that you should be doing, but you are not doing it. Doesn't matter the reasons behind that. It just means that this is something that you are not doing at this time. Not sure is just a flag that you can use that means that you need to look into it more. You need more information. You maybe will have somebody else working on that. And then NA means not applicable. Where people get tripped up is between no and not applicable. No means we should be doing this item, but we are not doing this item. Not applicable means we are not doing this item and we don't need to be doing this item. Now, again, this is your assessment. You use it however makes sense to you, but this does make a difference if you want to become a NAM best practice partner. And that is something that we will talk about here in a little bit. But to be a best practice partner, in short, means that you are saying that you are fully legally compliant in all areas of nonprofit operations that apply to you. So if you want to become a best practice partner and you have a legal compliance related item marked as no, that tells us you are out of compliance. However, if you mark that as not applicable, that means that you are in compliance. You are just simply not doing any given item because you don't need to. That doesn't apply to you. So now I want to take some time to dive into a few of these legal compliance items. I'm not going to go through all of them. There are more items related to legal compliance than we will talk about in this workshop. However, there are a few that tend to trip people up, and so I wanted to take a little bit of time to pull out those specifically. First of all, every nonprofit is required to have a document retention and destruction policy. NAM has templates for you to use if this is not a document that you have at this time, but you must have some sort of policy that guides how you will handle your records. And this policy should apply to any hard copy records as well as electronic records. And we're going to see an element of that again a little bit later in the assessment. Every nonprofit must have protections for whistleblowers, meaning you must have a procedure as well as protections that are written within your nonprofit policies that give a procedure for people to file complaints or to register any suspected ethical violations, fraudulent activity within the nonprofit, and then that policy must protect them from repercussions. And again, NAM has templates for you if this is a policy that you still need. It's in some nonprofits, particularly new small nonprofits, struggle with that third arrow, allowing personal use of organizational funds or business credit cards. Particularly in newer, smaller organizations, there is some blurring of funds between the nonprofit business and the personal funds of usually the founder or maybe some board members. This is something that is not allowed. And I want to note here that this particular item came straight from the Attorney General's office. We at NAM work closely with the state Attorney General to make sure that our tool is up to date, that our legal compliance items are accurate, and they share information with us about things that they're seeing in nonprofits that they're working with. And this intermingling of funds is one of the primary concerns that the state Attorney General's office has brought up fairly recently. And then finally, if your organization has investments, you must have some sort of policy that guides how often those are reviewed, who reviews them, who has authority to make decisions about them, and things like that. And again, there are many more items, particularly in financial management. We'll talk about a few more here in a bit, but these are ones that tend to trip people up a little bit. The next item I wanted to pull out is the requirement to do an audit. It is a best practice to do a formal audit within your nonprofit every year. However, it's important to understand that audits can be expensive, both in terms of time and money. We do recommend, and it is considered a requirement, to do some sort of review or compilation if you don't do a formal audit every year. If you receive over $750,000 in federal funding, you are legally required to conduct an annual audit. And important to note that there are some funding sources, foundations that require an audit as a condition of funding. However, the only time you are legally required to is if you receive over $750,000 in federal funds. It is also important to note that every nonprofit is required to file an annual Form 990. This is the tax document that every nonprofit must file. There was a time when very small nonprofits did not need to file a 990. However, those days are over. Every nonprofit, regardless of budget size, must file a 990 every year. Failure to file your 990 for 3 consecutive years will result in the loss of your 501c3 status. You can get it back, but it takes some work and some hassle that is just not worth it. Easier to just file your 990 on time every year. And just like we can with our personal tax forms, if you need an extension, you can request an extension if you're not able to file it by the deadline. There are lots of items related to legal compliance within fundraising. Many are fairly straightforward that most nonprofits are able to comply with fairly easily. I wanted to pull out a few here because this illustrates that Iowa, nonprofits that have operations in Iowa are regulated a little bit more when it comes to fundraising than those in Nebraska are. Now, another note about these state-specific items, they apply to you if you have a physical operation within that state, meaning you have a building there, or your business address is within that state. It is not uncommon for nonprofits in Omaha, Nebraska, or Council Bluffs, Iowa, to serve people that maybe are from a different state than they are in. However, the state-specific regulations only apply to you if you have a physical operation in that state. And the fundraising legal compliance items are a great illustration of how fundraising is a little bit more regulated in Iowa than it is in Nebraska. Commercial fundraisers must be registered with the Iowa Attorney General within Iowa, and any citizen can request the financials of a nonprofit organization within Iowa, and Iowa nonprofits are compelled to produce those when requested. Moving on to governance, the governance section helps us think through our procedures with our board of directors. This particular item on this slide that I wanted to point out is this language that says as indicated in bylaws. The bylaws of a nonprofit organization are our governing documents, and we must comply with anything that is written in our bylaws. After this training, I hope you will take a moment to find your bylaws and review them to make sure that your practices match what is written in your bylaws. If they don't, it's time to either change your practices or change your bylaws. This particular particular item relates to your officers. The officers of your board should be written out within your bylaws, and the powers that those officers or the duties that those officers hold should be written out within your bylaws. The other item that I wanted to pull out is this 2/3 independent language. The IRS requires that we have a board of directors. The minimum number of board members varies by state, but we must have a board of directors and 2/3 of the members must be independent, meaning they have no financial or familial relationship with the nonprofit organization. That means that they are not paid by the organization and they are not related to anyone who is paid by the organization. A few more items I wanted to pull out within the governance section are, first of all, your conflict of interest policy. Every nonprofit organization must have an up-to-date conflict of interest policy that guides how you will handle potential conflicts, as well as an opportunity for every key decision maker within your organization to disclose any potential conflicts in writing. The IRS uses this key decision maker language when it comes to conflict of interest. Most nonprofits interpret that as your board of directors. So your conflict of interest policy would guide your board practices. Some organizations will also extend that to your paid leadership within your organization. Some organizations extend this to all staff and maybe even some key volunteers. Again, there's that in accordance with our bylaws language there in relation to your annual meeting. And then finally, you should have written your recusal process for when board members will recuse themselves from any decisions in which a potential conflict of interest might be at play. If you would like to review your own conflict of interest policy in relation to another one, NAM has many resources for you to help you think that through. A few slides on the human resources section in relation to legal compliance. Again, as nonprofits, we are employers, and so we are beholden to employment law as well as the regulations that govern nonprofits specifically. Again, a whistleblower policy is something that is vital for every nonprofit that guides how a report might be made, to whom that report is made, and then again, protections from any repercussions as a result of that report. Also, we must comply with all employment laws, whether they are local, state, or federal, in terms of hiring, employing, performance reviews, and retention of employment records. A bit more about human resources and the legal compliance. We are required to have a compensation structure that is reasonable and substantiated and reviewed and approved by the board of directors. NAM has a resource to help you do this. We have the NAM salary and benefit report that is available for purchase to help you review your compensation structures as well as the benefit plans that you provide to your employees. Moving on to information technology, this is sometimes can be a fast-moving section where things change fairly quickly. So this is a great section to keep an eye on when we make those annual updates. We are required, just like any other business, to protect our records, whether those records have to do with our employees, the people we serve, our donors. If we have sensitive or confidential information, we are beholden to the same regulations that every other sector is. And again, we must, in our document retention and destruction policies, we must make sure that that applies to electronic records as well as hard copies or any other records that we may have. Just a quick note about the planning section. The planning section doesn't have a ton of items that are related to legal requirements. However, with later in the assessment, it helps you think through your operations and strategic planning. So it's a very handy section. The item that I wanted to pull out here was the language around your mission statement. We as nonprofits are legally required to adhere to our mission statement. So that means that we are using our mission statement when we are making decisions about the future of programs, adding new programs, our resource allocation decisions, all must be in line with our stated mission. It is important that we as nonprofits regularly review our mission statement in relation to the work that we're doing. If we find that our work is out of line with our mission statement, that may be a clue that either we may have drifted away from our mission a bit and adjustments in our programming is needed, or that may be a clue that it's time to refresh our mission and review it and maybe make some small changes. A quick note about public policy. If you engage in any sort of lobbying, public policy, advocacy activities, this is going to be a very handy section for you. It helps us think through how we track the funds or any time that is used in public policy. But really, the greatest gift of this public policy section often is helping nonprofits understand what we can do in terms of advocacy and public policy work. As long as we remain nonpartisan, we are obligated to advocate for issues that impact our communities, impact our organizations, or impact the people we serve. We are prohibited as nonprofits from supporting any particular party or any particular candidate. As long as we remain nonpartisan, outside of that, we are obligated as nonprofits to speak up for the communities and the people that we serve. If you have any questions about how your nonprofit can engage in public policy and advocacy, our public policy manager, Hannah, is happy to help you with that. So please don't hesitate to reach out to her. The final section that you'll see is transparency and accountability. We are, as nonprofits, legally required to be transparent and accountable to the general public. We are required to provide copies of our 990 as well as our IRS filing paperwork as requested by any member of the general public. We consider it a best practice to just post these items on your website so any member of the public can find them as needed. Moving on from the legal compliance items, once you complete the assessment, the portal will automatically generate a report for you. And it is a very simple report that is just simply a report out of all data that you have entered at that time. This is something that we hope you will use. You will maybe print out and make some notes on, but use it as a tool to create a plan for next steps as you increase your capacity and refine your infrastructure. We do have tools available for you to help you. This is not intended to be a replacement for staff, but it can be very helpful if you want to do your own research into each of the items. The Wiki is something that is an online tool that is arranged in the same order and mirrors the guidelines and principles assessment and has background information, tools and templates that you can download, or any other information that you may be seeking about any item that is within the guidelines and principles. A bit about the best practice partnership. Now, earlier in this training, I did say that the guidelines and principles was not a certification. It is still not a certification. The best practices partnership is simply an attestation that your organization has achieved full legal compliance, that your staff, leadership, as well as your board are committed to continuous quality and improvement, and that you are committed to ongoing use of the guidelines and principles. We hope that you will use it as a tool to promote dialogue among your organization, and we recognize our best practice partners on our website. So how to become a best practice partner is, first of all, you must be a 501c3 and have completed the guidelines and principles assessment. We hope you will discuss your resulting report with your board and key staff. Then from our website, you can download a resolution, which is simply, again, an attestation that will be signed by your executive director that says that we have completed the guidelines principles, we are fully legally compliant, and we are committed to ongoing nonprofit best practice. Then you send it in to NAM, and we will add you to our list of best practice partners. We have lots of resources that are available to you. The guidelines and principles is one. We also have a full training calendar that is available to you to help you skill up in all areas of nonprofit operations. We have a career center where you can post openings within your organization. That's one of the most heavily used pages on our website for folks seeking jobs in the nonprofit sector. We have leadership development programs such as the Nonprofit Executive Institute and the Rising Leaders Institute. Applications for those open in July. We have business partners that are committed to serving the nonprofit sector that range everywhere from financial help to insurance to nonprofit consultants that can help you in all areas of your operations. I encourage you to check them out on our website. We have a financial services program that is available to you that can provide accounting support for your nonprofit. We have a Best Care EAP program that your organization can sign up for that can allow you to provide mental health support for the employees within your organization. Again, that salary and benefits report that I mentioned earlier. We have an economic impact report that we use as an advocacy tool to help demonstrate the impact of the nonprofit sector, and an executive transition toolkit that can help you plan for the eventual transition of any of your staff within your organization. And all of these tools can be found on the NAM website, and any staff member is available to help you find those resources. With that, I thank you for participating in this training. Again, please do not hesitate to reach out to the Nonprofit Association of the Midlands if you have any questions.